Good morning, class. Today we're looking at what's called feminist methodologies, and we're looking at the ways that fieldwork can often become gendered. Now, before we start looking at feminist methodologies, let's discuss for a moment what feminism is. So in order to put into context what feminist methodologies are, we ought to have a working definition of what feminism is. Okay, so there are many definitions for what feminism is, based upon who you ask, but there is a basic and widely agreed upon definition, and that is that feminism is a movement to gain equality between genders and end sexism. So within that, feminists also believe that feminism is something that applies to and that allows for both males and females and people of all different gender designations to benefit. Okay, so feminists really envision living in a society within which there are policies and there are norms that allow for people of all gender designation, all sexes, to benefit equally and to live on equal and just footing. So in that regard, most people would actually define themselves as feminists, if feminism then is this desire for an equal and just society. Okay. Now, it's important to also know what feminism is not. Explicitly, feminism is not about women hating men, nor is it about women trying to strip men of their masculinity. Okay? Rather, it is bringing up a conversation about what's called patriarchy, which is the historical advantages that men have had throughout history. Okay? So women gained the right to vote in the United States only in 1920, so less than 100 years ago. And this is after decades-long struggles by women who were called suffragettes. They wanted to gain equal footing with men as citizens. However, the modern feminist movement that we see starting in the 1970s, they called for radical shift in how women were treated in all areas of public life. And the fact that women can vote today is thanks to early feminists. And the fact that we have laws preventing discrimination in the workplace based on gender or sexuality is due to the work of these later feminists starting in the 60s and in the 70s. Now, it's also important to note that we have a long way to go as a society. Women still only make about 78 cents for every dollar a man makes, and this gender gap has remained the same since the 1960s. So though a lot of people may feel like there is relative gender equality, women are still making significantly less money than men are and hold far less positions of power. It's also interesting to note that the United States is the only nation in the world, along with Papua New Guinea, where there is no federally mandated maternity leave. And that's an issue that I would argue that adversely affects both women and men, or people of any gender designation, should the couple choose to reproduce, right? Now, what are feminist methodologies? Now, the way that feminist methodologies came about is as a reaction to a lot of very male-biased research. So throughout time, there's mostly been men who have been the researchers, and as a consequence, oftentimes they have focused on men's activities. So they've done research. Many anthropologists, many political scientists have, focused on men's wealth, men's habits, situated the power that exists in a culture and a society within the realm of male activity. Okay, so feminist methodologies is research that seeks to overcome this gender bias in research. Okay, feminist people who do feminist methods, they also have a desire to bring about social change. And this change is based on, creating this equal and just society that early feminists envisioned. Crucially, feminist methods entail acknowledging the position of the researcher. Okay. So this is a really important point that we're going to really delve into in the next few slides. Okay, so feminist methodologies understand gender as being what's called a social construct. For those of you who have taken any sociology courses or any anthropology courses, you understand the idea of a social or a cultural construct. And this basically means that there's no universal law that dictates why people think or behave in a particular way. All thought and behavior is mediated by historical forces and by culturally specific ideas about the world. So there are certain characteristics that people attribute to males and females that are culturally and not biologically determined. And that's not to say that there isn't what's called sexual dimorphism between the genders, but it is the realization that being a woman in today's society is something that you learn from a very early age, and being a male and all of that entails is something that is learned, and therefore it's something that we can sort of unlearn in the way that we raise our children and in the way that we understand the world. Okay, so there's a bunch of terms here that I just want to throw at you just to get a little bit more specific into what it means to do feminist methods. So androcentricity is taking on a male-centered perspective on an issue, okay? Gynocentricity is taking on a female-centered perspective on an issue. Oftentimes, a lot of male critics and female critics will say that, oh, you're being so feminist and I don't like feminism and that sort of thing. And they're critiquing what they perceive as being gynocentricity, so this very sort of female-centered perspective. Feminism is not gynocentricity. Feminism is rather, working for equal rights for both men and women. So I keep saying this, and I'm going to keep saying this over and over again. Feminism is as much for the benefit of men as it is for women or any other gender designation. Okay. Overgeneralizing, right? It means to over-apply data from a sample to a population. Now, this is something that is critiqued in feminist theory. Gender blindness. That's the failure to address gender in your research. Now, we've seen this in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of research texts, many of which you've probably read in many of your classes. You can go through an entire text and not, even have the mention of the fact that the author might be male or female, and that changes the way that they conduct their research and the data that they've been able to collect. Having double standards, right? So this is, of course, having a different standard for two similar groups, okay? Interference. Interference happens when the sex of the researcher causes interference with the results. And this is something that is almost impossible to avoid, okay? I've experienced this in my own research. But there are ways of overcoming interference to where it's not a negative thing, where you can use it to your advantage. Okay, one of the things that inspired me to start thinking as a feminist very early on, I think I was perhaps 20 years old when I saw this poster in a dorm room. Okay, I'm just going to read it out for you. It's kind of long, but it's worth your while. For every girl who's tired of acting weak when she is strong, there's a boy tired of appearing strong when he feels vulnerable. For every boy who's burdened with the constant expectation of knowing everything, there's a girl tired of people not trusting her intelligence. For every girl who's tired of being called oversensitive, there's a boy who fears to be gentle, to weep. For every boy for whom competition is the only way to prove his masculinity, there is a girl who is called unfeminine when she competes. For every girl who throws out her easy-bake oven, there is a boy who wishes to find one. For every boy struggling not to let advertising dictate his desires, there is a girl facing the ad industry's attack on her self-esteem. For every girl who takes a step towards her liberation, there is a boy who finds the way to freedom a little easier. I like this poster because it is illustrative of one of the main points of feminism, that it's not just about women, it's about men too. When women are liberated, men can be liberated as well. This is not just about, women being allowed to wear pants and to get promotions. This is also about men being able to express their sensitivities, being able to cry. This is also about, men being able to take paternity leave if they want to stay home with their children for a few months when they're young. So there are a lot of issues, when we start talking about feminism, where men often very quickly feel alienated from the conversation. And I am here to tell you, as well as many other feminists, that men should not feel alienated. You should feel deeply engaged and hopefully grateful and want, a feeling of wanting to participate in feminist projects and wanting to call yourself a feminist, because you really understand that this is about both men and women. All right, on to our reading. Our first reading today is by Diane Bell, and she's an anthropologist. And in the anthology that we read the introduction to, called Gendered Fields, Women, Men, and Ethnography, the author takes seriously the perception that the ethnographer's gender significantly changes the politics of doing fieldwork. Okay, so she points out that theory, culture, and gender all prohibit and conversely enable a field worker's limited and situated perceptions, as do her contacts with the people in the community where she is studying. Okay, so this is the idea that your gender, who you are, your background matters when you're doing research. It changes what you see. It changes the research questions that you ask, and it changes the data that you are able to accumulate. And this is particularly true when we're doing ethnographic research because of the very nature of ethnography, which is involving interviews and participant observations, where you are out in the field, you're engaging with real people, and real people respond to gender differences and differences in your ethnicity, your race, your background, your socioeconomic status, and all these things. Okay, so notice how, when you do the reading, notice how Bell does what's called a genealogy of gender, or a gendered genealogy. And the way she does this is that she traces how gender is talked about in various ethnographic texts over the past 100 years. And she finds that, and I quote, "The gendered nature of our fields has been left to women anthropologists to ponder and feminist scholars to critique, and even then their work has been largely ignored." So Bell presents works by all these numerous authors, primarily from the fields of anthropology and ethnography, that deal with gender and fieldwork. The texts she mentions can serve as guides for those of you who may wish to discuss feminist methodologies or issues of gender in your own research. So as you go through this reading, it's kind of meant as a literature review for you, if those of you who are interested in pursuing feminist methods or feminist thinking in the future, you will find here sort of a summary of the main thinkers within the field. Okay, so you can very easily use Bell here as your jumping off point if you're wanting to get into further what it means to do feminist research and who these feminist researchers are. When Bell asks us, does the gender of the researcher matter? she's imploring us to really think about the way that, your gender and where you're coming from really affects the results of the information you're able to gather in the field. And she's pointing out that for centuries, men have been free to write from the perspective of what's called the generic he, right? So he has been the one to sort of set the standard of how research is talked about and how information is disseminated. So in order to grapple with how gender affects our research, we must first look within. And she looks to Margaret Mead, who is one of the first and greatest women anthropologists, who says, know thyself. Okay, and what she means by that is you need to be reflexive. And we've talked about reflexivity before, which is a process whereby the researcher examines his or herself and what shapes his or her beliefs and how that in turn affects the questions and outcomes of research. Okay. All right. On to Donna Haraway. Now, some of you will probably find this reading to be a bit challenging. Donna Haraway is often critiqued for writing in a way that is a bit complicated. So I'm throwing this research at you because it's one of the seminal texts within feminist methodologies that has really changed the way that we think about the world. Now, the most important point that I want you to take away from this article is that Donna Haraway is attempting to critique and deconstruct objectivity. Okay? And the way that she does that is to talk about a concept that she calls situated knowledges. So what does it mean for knowledge to be situated? Okay? She says that feminist objectivity means quite simply situated knowledges. So that basically means that you're always arguing from a particular location, position, or situation, right? You're always going to be talking from the perspective either as woman, male, transgender, whatever gender designation that you give yourself, you're going to be speaking from that perspective. You're also going to be speaking from the perspective of perhaps someone who's highly educated or someone who is uneducated, someone who is wealthy, someone who is perhaps not so wealthy. So what's important here is to situate yourself within a conversation about knowledge and be honest about your perspective. Where are you coming from? What are the motivations that you have for speaking in the way that you do? Okay. One of the interesting concepts that she throws at us is this the concept of phallogocentrism. Okay. And she talks about how phallogocentric positivism is the male gaze that attempts to surveil, which means to overlook and to observe, and to see all from nowhere. Okay, so this is the way that technology reaches into the far corners of our existence, the outer and inner universes of our worlds. And she says that this eye can often be perceived as perverse, probing, and invasive. Okay, so this is what she critiques as phallogocentric. And that's, a direct critique of how knowledge up until very, very recently has been very male-centered, right? So how do we kind of upset this balance of the male gaze? And also, why can we just have a gaze, or can we start being honest about whether our gaze is biased towards being male or female? And she goes on to say that only partial perspective promises objective vision. Okay? She argues that we ought to start seeing from below because we're all speaking from somewhere. Okay? Now, this is a sort of a a point that she's trying to make, that, you know, we need to start seeing the standpoint of the subjugated person, because this also allows for a more adequate, sustained, objective, and transforming account of the world. Okay, so if we're constantly listening to stories based on what the master narrative is, what, you know, the perspective of the most powerful, we're going to miss a lot of these counter narratives that are really important when we're going to try to create a complete history. Okay. Haraway attempts this critique of relativism, this possibility of perhaps being nowhere but claiming to be everywhere equally. And she says that the equality of positioning is a denial of responsibility and critical inquiry. She calls this the God trick, that idea of being everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And this is a false promise of objectivity, relativity, and universality, right? So we have to, you know, really admit to ourselves that we all speak from somewhere. There's no such thing as objective standpoints, right? There is no innocent identity politics. We are all speaking from somewhere. So the idea is, where are you speaking from? How do you get to a point where you can admit to yourself where you're speaking from, and then you move on and you're able to unearth you know, a more interesting critical inquiry in your research. She talks about the material semiotic actor, the material being the real, the embodied person, semiotic meaning the symbolic. Okay, so you are both material and semiotic. You're a real person, but you also symbolize a lot of things, and you also interpret the world in terms of you know, its symbolisms. And she says that this actor is not a passive object of observation, but takes a role in its own construction. I'm just going to play you a very, very short clip from my own research. And here I am, one of my first attempts to do what's called embodied ethnographic field research. So I do research with refugees from the Shan state in northern Burma who have fled the violence and war going on in that area to neighboring Thailand. And one of the ways that they deal with some of the war and trauma that they've experienced is through dance and theater displays such as this. So rather than simply going about doing my research by doing just interviews and observing, I decided very early on that I would need to also really engage and participate and embody some of the cultural expressions that they engage in. So part of that is going through this very embarrassing sequence of learning how to do their traditional dance. And so here's a little clip of me doing that. Now the reason that I wanted to share this with you is because this is my attempt to do the kind of research that Donna Haraway is asking us to do, right? It is about situating my perspective within the cultural norms and knowledge systems of these refugees, and doing that in a way where I'm not looking at them from above, rather I'm positioning myself as a student of their world. And I'm not just doing that by asking them questions, I'm doing that by also engaging in the everyday practices that they engage in. And therefore I'm able to, in a way, embody some of the knowledge that they pass down, you know, through their generations, you know, to their children. And that's how they understand the world. And I'm able to access that, and they're able to trust that I'm really sincere in the way that I do my research, because I'm actually out there engaging with them and wanting to learn from them in the way that a student wants to learn from a teacher. So this is one way of doing a kind of a feminist inquiry, or doing a Haraway-esque sort of situated knowledge type research. Okay. So to conclude here, we come back to this notion of reflexivity, right? Like Margaret Mead says, you must know thyself in order to know the other. Okay, so when we're doing social science research, you kind of have to start with yourself, right? So you have all engaged in these research projects now that are based on your own interests, and the way that you conduct your own research is in many ways colored by your gender, your economic status, your age, your ethnic background, and all of the experiences of your life that make up who you are. Now, the important thing is that we learn from feminist methodologies is that instead of trying to erase your background, try instead to write about it. Be honest with yourself about who you are and how that shapes your perception. Objectivity is actually a really dangerous concept in research. If researchers try to pretend that he or she stands above the data and that their worldview never colors the way the research is conducted and presented. So this is really important. Your job in this class is to not be objective. I don't want you to be objective. There is no such thing as being objective. It is an unobtainable goal. And I want you to just really kind of think about that as you write, your final paper. Your job is not to be objective. Your job is to be reflexive. Okay? So how do you do reflexive research? Well, you begin by writing and thinking about yourself and how your experiences and your background shape your worldview. Now, you've already done that in the form of your autoethnography, okay? Now, next week, we're going to explore what's called narrative IR or narrative politics. And you'll be asked to do an exercise where you write a narrative. And you'll also read a narrative text that can help you get thinking about how reflexivity can help us gain a deeper understanding of the political. Okay, so I encourage all of you in your own research and in your own daily thinking to not try to strive for this objective, non-bias perspective when you're writing, but rather really engage with, perhaps it's your background growing up in Hawaii or growing up somewhere outside of Hawaii. Perhaps it's your background being exposed to homelessness, having friends who are homeless or friends who have grown up on an Indian reservation, or perhaps you have some kind of spiritual connection with your research. Explore that in your final papers. I'd love to hear your own narrative and your own voice come forth. What I don't want to see is this, I'm going to come up with this unbiased research because, that isn't really possible. So it's a much more honest way of doing research if we start just grappling with, where am I coming from? Why is this important to me? And then we can start really getting into some deeper questions in our research. All right, folks, happy reading and writing this week, and you'll be getting another lecture from me next week. Take care.